Okay, here we go. We're reading a story from Rowley Jeffersons' awesome, friendly, spooky stories by Jeff Kinney. Story reading is The Nap. Shzz. There once was a woman who lived in a retirement community all by herself, and her name was Frances. But everyone in her family called her Great Aunt Fanny, or just Fanny for short. Speaking of her family, Fanny didn't have any kids, but she had lots of nieces and nephews, and they all had kids of their own. But none of them ever came to visit Fanny because they were too wrapped up in their own lives to visit her. Fanny lived in a little condo, but she had a really big TV. She needed a big TV because her eyesight wasn't that great. And the only thing that really made her happy was watching her soap operas. Every day, Fanny would do the same thing. She'd watch her programs until she got tired, and then she'd take a nap in her comfy chair. And when she was done with her nap, she'd make herself a sandwich and watch more soap operas until the news came on. One day, while she was watching her programs, she saw an ad for something she thought might be useful for a person like her. It was this little gadget with a button on it that you could press if you ever fell and needed help. Senior SOS. Help! Press for assistance. Fanny thought that might be a good thing to have since she lived alone. So she called the number on the screen and placed an order, which was the first time she'd ever spent money on something like that. In fact, the only thing Fanny ever did with her money was write checks for her nieces and nephews and their kids on their birthdays. And even though Fanny was never late with a birthday card, she never got a thank you from anyone except for her 6-year-old great niece Amber, who was the only one in the family who wasn't rotten. Thank you for the money, Great Aunt Fanny, Amber. On the weekends, Fanny's routine was a little different because her soap operas weren't on TV on those days. So she'd usually have a big lunch and then take on an extra long nap afterward. One Saturday, everyone in town was all excited because it was the day of the big game. And since the tickets to the big game were sold out, most people had to watch it on TV. Well, no one in Fanny's family had a big TV, but they knew someone who did. So a few hours before the big game, Gary Mack and a bunch of guys piled into his pickup truck and headed to Great Aunt Fanny's retirement community. But when they got to Fanny's condo and knocked on the door, no one answered. So little Dougie turned the doorknob and it was unlocked. Aunt Fanny was asleep in her comfy chair in front of the TV, and when they saw her sitting there with her head tilted forward, they thought she was dead. The guys were all pretty sad because Fanny was their oldest relative and also because she was always on time with those birthday checks. But they didn't have a lot of time for tears because the big game was only a few hours away. So Gary Mack made a few calls and found a funeral home that could move things along that afternoon. It turned out that the people in the funeral home wanted to watch the big game too, so after a quick service, everyone was out of there. You might be thinking, oh no, Great Aunt Fanny got buried alive. But you probably forgot that Fanny ordered that electronic gadget, and when she woke up, she just pressed the button to call for help. Well, that thing worked just as good as they said it did on the commercial, and the help arrived a few minutes later, and luckily the guys from the company figured out what happened pretty quickly. Screech! After they got Fanny out of the ground, they gave her a ride back to her retirement community. And when Fanny opened the door to her condo, she was pretty surprised by what she found. Gary Mack and all the other guys were happy to see Fanny alive, but they were also a little distracted because the big game was on and the score was really close. Gary Mack didn't want to give up his seat in the front comfy chair in front of the TV, so Fanny had to sit on the couch with the other guys. Goal! Oh, it's a bit mean, isn't it? After the big game was over and everyone told Fanny they sure were glad she was alive, but then they all went home and left a huge mess for her to clean up on her own. After that day, things pretty much went back to normal, except Fanny started putting a little less money in everyone's birthday cards. Fanny also started locking the door to her condo before she sat down for her afternoon naps because she really didn't want a repeat of what happened before. And just to make double sure she didn't get buried alive again, she cut out a ping pong ball in half and drew a dot on each side so she could look like she was awake even when she wasn't. A few months later, Amber found out what had happened to Great Aunt Fanny on the day of the big game, and she felt terrible about it, so she came to visit Fanny at her condo. Fanny and Amber had a ball making cookies, and they promised they'd do it again soon. From that day on, every time the family had a get-together, Amber made sure Fanny was invited, and those were some of the happiest days of Fanny's life. Gary Mack's family even invited her to join them on their summer vacation, and she was really excited about that. So this story kind of has a happy ending because Fanny's good-for-nothing family turned themselves around before it was too late, and it was all because of the kindness of a 6-year-old girl. But this story has a sad ending too, because right before the start of the summer vacation, Great Aunt Fanny passed away and no one ever noticed until the week was halfway over. Whoa, that's a macabre ending.